What if I told you that the most powerful company in history didn't come from Silicon Valley, but from the canals of Amsterdam? That long before Apple, Google, Tesla, or Meta even existed, there was another empire. One so vast, so rich, and so ruthless, it makes today's tech giants look small. At its peak, it was worth the modern equivalent of $8 trillion. It ruled the seas, controlled global trade, and reshaped entire continents. This is the story of the Dutch East India Company, the first multinational corporation, the first company to issue public shares, and one of the most brutal engines of empire the world has ever seen. But before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss more stories hidden behind the world we live in today. Before there were corporations, before Wall Street, before Google, Apple, Tesla, or Meta, there was spice. And in the 1500s, spice didn't just add flavor to food. It meant wealth. It meant power. It meant control. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, simple things by today's standards, but back then, these were the most valuable goods on earth. They came from islands far away, hidden deep in the tropics of Asia. The Spice Islands, they were called, and for a while, only one nation knew how to reach them. That nation was Portugal. By the early 16th century, Portugal had carved out a powerful maritime empire. Its ships had sailed past the edge of old maps, past the southern tip of Africa, and into the mysterious seas of the east. They built secret routes and guarded them with their lives. Forts rose along the coastlines of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Portuguese captains controlled the flow of spices into Europe, and they didn't intend to share. They were the gatekeepers of flavor, of fortune, of empire. But just as Portugal was rising, another place was stirring with ambition: the Low Countries, known today as the Netherlands. Back then, the Dutch didn't control much. Their cities like Antwerp and Bruges were wealthy, but they were not free. They lived under the rule of the Spanish crown, a crown that had become entangled in a dynastic union with Portugal. That meant one thing for the Dutch: exclusion. The Portuguese, backed by Spanish power and German money, deliberately cut off Dutch merchants from the spice trade. Ports that once thrived with goods suddenly went quiet. Ships that once carried exotic cargo were left dry. And if that wasn't enough, the tension between Spain and the Dutch was boiling over for another reason: religion. Spain was Catholic, fiercely Catholic. The Dutch had turned Protestant, embracing a new faith, and with it, a new identity. Spain saw them as heretics and rebels, and in 1566 the Dutch finally had enough. They revolted. It was the beginning of what would become the 80 Years' War, a long, bloody struggle for independence. But this wasn't just a war for land or faith. It was a war for control, of trade, of wealth, and of destiny. As Spanish troops marched through Dutch towns and Portuguese merchants tightened their grip on global trade, the Dutch merchants watched their future slipping away. But they weren't ready to give up. If the Portuguese wouldn't let them buy spices, the Dutch would sail east and take them. If the Spanish called them rebels, they would become something new, something the world had never seen before. They would fight fire with fire and trade with power. Here's where things start to turn. A quiet war was brewing, not on battlefields, but on shipping lanes, in boardrooms, in whispers shared over candlelit maps. Dutch merchants began to gather. They pooled their money, hired sailors, and searched for the one thing they didn't have: the route to the east. The Portuguese guarded that secret like a crown jewel, but no secret stays buried forever. A stolen map here, a bribed sailor there. Piece by piece, the Dutch began to reconstruct the forbidden paths across the Indian Ocean. And then they set sail. They didn't know exactly where they were going. The seas were hostile, the lands unknown, but spices, wealth, and power were promised waiting at the end of that journey. The race had begun, and it would change the world forever. With stolen charts and hastily gathered knowledge, the Dutch prepared for their first true test. In 1595, a small fleet of 4 ships slipped out of the Netherlands under the command of a man named Cornelis de Houtman. He wasn't a seasoned explorer, he wasn't a hero. He was a merchant's man, and he was about to lead one of the most dangerous voyages in European history. The fleet's destination was Java. The goal was simple: get to the port of Bantam, the gateway to Pepper, and come back with enough spice to turn a profit. But the sea does not forgive mistakes. From the start, the journey was cursed. The ships faced rough weather, navigational errors, and tropical disease. Half the crew would never return. The survivors clashed with Portuguese rivals and local Javanese who didn't trust these strange new traders. The Dutch were seen as intruders, and they acted like it. There were fights and deaths. By the time the fleet limped back to the Netherlands in 1597, it had been 2 brutal years at sea. But still, they brought home spice. At least enough to sell and make money. The Portuguese weren't invincible, and the Dutch weren't going to stop. That first taste of the East lit a fire in the Dutch Republic. Investors took notice, merchants started organising, and in 1598 they tried again, this time with a much larger fleet. 8 ships, better prepared, better funded, led by Jacob van Neck, and Van Neck's expedition was everything de Houtman's was not. Where the first mission had stumbled, this one soared. The fleet reached the Maluku Islands, the true Spice Islands, where nutmeg and cloves grew wild, and this time they came prepared to trade, to deal, and if necessary, to fight. The ships returned to Europe in waves, loaded with goods, and this time profit was 400%. For every coin invested, the merchants got 4 back. It was the kind of return that didn't just make men rich, it changed the way people thought about money, about trade, and about the future. But not everything glittered like gold. These journeys were long and brutal. Ships could vanish without a trace. The waters between Europe and Asia were a graveyard for the unlucky and the underprepared. For every Van Neck who returned a hero, there were others who never came back at all. That risk and the fear that one shipwreck could wipe out an entire investment made people nervous. So the question became, how do you keep chasing the East without risking everything on one roll of the dice? That's when Dutch merchants began to think bigger. A storm was coming, not from the sea, but from the minds of Dutch businessmen who were about to change the rules of the game. Because after years of war, risk, and blood spilled across 2 oceans, the Dutch were ready to build something new, something the world had never seen before. By the end of the 1500s, the seas had changed. The Dutch had proven that they could reach the East. They had proven they could trade. They had even proven they could make enormous profits. But with every success, a new problem emerged: competition. After the first few voyages, dozens of merchant groups across the Dutch Republic scrambled to launch their own expeditions. Suddenly, ships from Amsterdam, Zeeland, Rotterdam, and other provinces were racing one another across the same ocean, all chasing the same prize. It was chaos. Dutch ships undercut each other at ports, drove up prices, and fought over who would trade where. The same nation that had challenged the Portuguese risked tearing itself apart from within, not with swords, but with greed. Something had to change. The Dutch needed unity. They needed order, and they needed a system that could take all of these scattered ambitions and focus them into one unstoppable force. And so, in 1602, the Dutch government stepped in. With the backing of the States General, the various merchant factions were forced to merge into a single unified trading body. It would be called the Vereenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the VOC, known in English as the Dutch East India Company. At first glance, it was just another trading company, but this was something different. This was not a fleet of ships. It was not a collection of traders. It was not even a business in the way people understood business at the time. The VOC was a revolution. For the first time in history, the world saw the birth of a multinational corporation. The VOC didn't just belong to one port or one city. It was made up of 6 chambers across the Dutch Republic: Amsterdam, Middelburg, Rotterdam, Delft, Enkhuizen, and Hoorn, all working together under one roof. This was an empire in the making, and it didn't stop there. To fund its operations, the VOC did something no one had ever done before. It offered shares of the company to the public. Any citizen of the Dutch Republic, if they had the money, could buy a piece of the action. Investors didn't just lend their gold and silver, they bought ownership. Those shares could be sold, they could be traded, and soon they were. From this simple idea, something new was born. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the the first of its kind, a marketplace for investors, a hub of risk and reward. For the first time, people could make money not by working the land, but investing in the unknown. And even more remarkable was what came next. The VOC was granted limited liability, meaning shareholders couldn't lose more than they had invested. If the company failed, they would not be hunted for more. This one change opened the gates for a new class of investor, people willing to take a chance because the risk was now manageable. But the most dangerous part of the VOC was its power. This company, as a private business, was given rights that usually belonged only to governments. It could build forts, it could wage war, it could mint its own coins, it could claim land, it could colonize, it could rule. In many parts of the world, when the VOC arrived, it didn't knock on the door, it kicked it in. Backed by cannons and contracts, its representatives spoke with the authority of a nation, but answered only to shareholders. Every decision, every conquest, every drop of blood spilled on foreign soil could be traced back to boardrooms in Amsterdam. At home, investors cheered as profits rolled in. Abroad, the VOC began expanding aggressively. Its ships would cross oceans not in ones or twos, but in massive fleets. Its merchants were backed by soldiers, its deals were backed by muskets. This was no longer about exploration, this was about domination. The formation of the VOC didn't just change trade, it changed the structure of global power. It set the blueprint for the modern corporation, for stock markets, for corporate law, but it also laid the foundation for something darker, for the merging of profit and violence, business and empire. The ink had barely dried on the VOC's charter when the company began its next move, the transformation from a powerful business into a global empire. This was no longer just about profit, it was about control and dominance. And to do that, the VOC needed more than ships and shares. It needed land, forts, and the loyalty, or fear, of everyone who stood in its way. The first target was clear, the islands of Indonesia. These were the legendary Spice Islands, home to nutmeg, cloves, and mace, the rare goods that had first sparked the fire of global trade. The VOC wasted no time. One by one, it began setting up trading posts and military bases along the coasts of Java, Sumatra, and the Maluku Islands. But a trading post was never just a warehouse. It was a foothold, a mark in the sand that the Dutch had arrived. In 1619, a VOC fleet stormed the port city of Jakarta. The Dutch razed it to the ground and rebuilt it in their own image. Its new name, Batavia. Today we know it as Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, but back then it was something else entirely. It became the heart of VOC operations in Asia, the command center from which an empire was run. From Batavia, the VOC reached further, to India, where Dutch posts sprang up along the Coromandel and Malabar coasts, to China, where merchants sought porcelain and silk, to Japan, where the VOC secured a rare and powerful opportunity. In the early 1600s, Japan had begun closing itself off to the outside world. Foreign traders were banned, foreign religions were outlawed, but the Dutch found a way in. In Nagasaki, they were allowed to trade, under strict conditions, from an artificial island called Deima. No other Europeans were given this access, only the VOC. For more than 200 years, the Dutch East India Company would be Japan's only window to the West. But with every new connection, there was a price, and that price was nowhere higher than on the Banda Islands. The Banda were tiny and remote and quiet, but they grew nutmeg, and that made them valuable. The VOC wanted it all, not a share, not a trade deal, but total control. And in 1621, they sent a man to make that happen, Jan Pieterszoon Koen, the company's ruthless Governor-General. When the local Bandanese resisted VOC rule, Koen launched a brutal campaign. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, thousands were killed or starved, others were enslaved. By the end, the native population had nearly vanished. Nutmeg groves that had once been tended by islanders were now worked by forced labourers brought in under the Dutch whip. And it wasn't just happening in Indonesia. Across the known world, the company's influence grew. In 1652, a new outpost was established at the southern tip of Africa. Its purpose was simple: to find a place for VOC ships to rest and supply on their way to and from Asia. But over time, that small station grew into something far larger, the Cape Colony. What began as a service stop soon became a full-fledged settlement, laying the foundations of Dutch rule in South Africa. From Amsterdam to Batavia, from Daima to Cape Town, the VOC's web was spreading. Using silver, often brought in from Japan, the Dutch brought goods that Europeans craved but could not produce: silk, cotton, porcelain, lacquerware, and tea. These goods were shipped across the sea and sold at enormous profit back home. The company no longer relied on one product or one place. It had become a machine, a network of ships, ports, and deals stretching across continents. The VOC had built its empire not just with money, but with force and fear, and in doing so, it had planted seeds across Asia, some of trade and others of hatred. By the year 1669, the Dutch East India Company stood alone at the top of the world. No business before had ever come close. No business since has ever quite matched it. The numbers were staggering. More than 150 merchant ships crossed the oceans under the VOC's flag, sleek, armed vessels ferrying spices, silk, porcelain, and tea from Asia to Europe in a never-ending flow of wealth. 40 warships protected those routes, ready to enforce the company's dominance with cannon fire if needed. 50,000 employees worked across its empire, with 10,000 soldiers ready to fight, guard, or conquer. Its investors, many of whom had never stepped foot on a ship or seen a port, were rewarded handsomely. At times, the VOC paid dividends as high as 40%. That meant wealth not just for traders or nobles, but for anyone who had the courage to buy a share when the company was young. It was the kind of return that turned merchants into kings. The VOC had become a gatekeeper of global trade. It controlled the flow of nutmeg from Banda, cinnamon from Ceylon, silk from China, and porcelain from Japan. No ship sailed through the key routes of the Indian Ocean or Southeast Asia without the VOC knowing or approving. But something was beginning to shift. It was easy to miss at first, just a few whispers among traders in Amsterdam or murmurs in distant ports. But over time, the signs became louder. The winds that had once carried the VOC to greatness began to turn. The first warning came from Europe itself. For more than a century, spices had ruled the markets. They were exotic, rare, and expensive. But by the late 1600s, a change in taste and fashion was sweeping across the continent. Tea, coffee, sugar, and cotton were becoming the new obsessions of the European elite. Spices no longer dazzled in the same way. Prices began to fall, markets began to shift, and with that shift came competition. England, France, and Denmark were no longer just watching from the sidelines. Their own East India companies were rising. They built ships, struck deals, and carved out colonies. The English, especially, were bold and aggressive. Their navy grew stronger. Their presence in India became harder to ignore. The once undisputed monopoly of the VOC was suddenly being challenged on every front. In response, the VOC changed its strategy. If it could no longer survive on high-margin spices, it would pivot to high-volume commodities: tea, coffee, textiles, sugar. These goods could still bring profit if traded in enormous quantities, and so the VOC grew larger, sent out more ships, expanded its ports, and stretched its networks even further. But with that expansion came rising costs. Warehouses had to be built, armies had to be paid, bureaucracy swelled. And beneath the surface, a darker problem was growing: corruption, inefficiency, and brutality. Far from the watchful eyes of Amsterdam, VOC officials in Asia became kings in their own right. They skimmed profit, hoarded goods, and ruled with iron fists. Colonies became nests of abuse. Slavery expanded, forced labor increased, and when resistance rose, from workers to locals, from anyone who dared to question the system, the company answered with violence. But soon the greatest company the world had ever seen would find itself facing storms it could no longer weather. For nearly 2 centuries, the Dutch East India Company had commanded oceans, toppled cities, and bent empires to its will. But no empire, no matter how rich or far-reaching, is immune to rot. And by the mid-1700s, the VOC's decay was no longer invisible. It began with a spark and ended in fire. In 1740, in the heart of the company's Asian empire, a storm of violence tore through Batavia, the city once built as a beacon of Dutch control. Rumours had begun to circulate among VOC officials that the Chinese community, growing in number and economic influence, was planning an uprising. No one could prove it, but in an age of paranoia and power built on fear, proof wasn't needed. The response was swift and savage. Dutch soldiers, aided by native allies, unleashed a wave of terror across the city. More than 10,000 Chinese residents were hunted down and killed, in their homes, in the streets, in hiding. It was a massacre disguised as security, a purge disguised as order. When the smoke cleared, Batavia was quiet again, but something had changed. The world was beginning to see the cracks, and so was the company itself. The massacre wasn't just a stain on the VOC's reputation, it was a signal. The careful balance that had once held its empire together was slipping. Across Asia, VOC influence began to unravel. In India, the British East India Company surged ahead. Stronger, better organised and backed by the growing power of the British Crown, the English left the Dutch in the dust. In Japan, the once exclusive Dutch access to the island grew weaker as political winds shifted. The privilege of being the only European traders in Nagasaki became more ceremonial than strategic. In Southeast Asia, the VOC's grip weakened, local resistance stiffened, profits dwindled, trade routes grew riskier, and then came the final blow: war. In the 1780s, the Dutch found themselves pulled into the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, a conflict that would all but destroy the VOC's remaining strength. The British Navy, powerful, aggressive and globally coordinated, targeted VOC ships, ports and colonies with ruthless efficiency. Merchant vessels were seized, forts were taken, entire fleets were lost. The VOC's trade routes, once the lifeblood of the company, were choked off. Without trade, there was no profit. Without profit, there was only debt. Desperate VOC directors proposed reforms, but it was too late. Corruption ran deep. In the boardrooms of Amsterdam, frustrated shareholders demanded answers and action, but they got neither. Debt piled up. The company borrowed just to stay afloat. The once proud stock that had built the world's first exchange now sank into worthlessness. And finally, in 1799, the unthinkable happened. After nearly 200 years, the VOC collapsed. The Dutch government stepped in, nationalised its assets, and absorbed its remaining territories into what would later become the Dutch East Indies. The greatest company the world had ever seen was gone. But the fall of the VOC didn't mark the end of its influence. In many ways, it was only the beginning. Its trade routes became the arteries of European colonial rule, its outposts evolved into colonies, and its ruthless model of profit through dominance, resource extraction and control became the blueprint for centuries of imperialism. Across Indonesia, South Africa, Sri Lanka and beyond, the VOC left more than buildings and names. It left behind social hierarchies, broken economies, and wounds that would take generations to heal. The wealth it extracted fueled Europe's rise, but left scars across the global south that remain visible today. So we're left with one final question. If the world's first mega-corporation could reshape the world so profoundly, what will today's giants leave behind?